You have 360 odd episodes.
I told my mom. The first reaction was, isn't that like too much?
How the hell did you stay so consistent over so long?
How to stay consistent? Like there's...
That's why most people haven't reached their goals. It's just hard to be consistent.
In Zelda, right? You have to go places, right? You go to the next door.
Having a podcast that has 360 episodes is an exercise in discipline, consistency.
And they always tell you like consistency is key.
That discipline, consistency in the right domain, of course, opens new doors for you as well.
I would never be able to live off at this point. There's all the other things and the other doors that can get open. And that might be the place where you end. Or maybe you hit a gold mine. You don't really know until you start trying.
You gotta play the game to be part of it.
I wish I told you there was a switch I just flipped on and it's just kept me going, but you know, it's...
Rob, you have 360 odd episodes, right? How the hell did you stay so consistent over so long? That's my number one question.
So it's funny you say that. The first thing when I was saying, I'm going to do a podcast on gamification, right? And game-based learning and these things. I started telling, of course, who do you tell first, right? The closest people to you. You know, I told my wife, I told some friends, I told my mom. My mom, the first reaction was, but you're going to do it weekly? Isn't that like too much? How long are you going to last? Like 6 months? And I was like, no, you know, there's quite a few people in the space, right? So I'm sure I can last for some time, and we'll see where it goes when I get to the point if I don't find anybody new. 360 episodes later, I can tell you, I have booked for this week in particular. It's not always like that, but I had 4 guests scheduled. All of them, you know, high quality guests. One of them not directly in gamification. That'll come up in a few weeks probably. It was more on objectives, which is a key part when you're talking about a gamification. So I wanted to delve right very in and deep with an expert on this, which I found, can't remember exactly where. I'm on all kinds of directories, and to be honest, most of the directories are almost useless for my podcast because nobody that is in the space I've found, you know, out of 360, I've maybe found, at best, I found 20 through those episodes, through those directories. It's mostly me, you know, grinding, or, you know, I get a guest recommendation from somebody, I reach out, or I read a book and I reach out and that kind of stuff. And how to stay consistent, like I wish there was this sort of trick that you flip the switch and it just works. But I don't know. Like I've always sort of thrived in a place where I say, look, I'm going to do this, and I just have to do it, right? And it's been mostly me up until relatively recently. It's just me doing stuff there. If I didn't have an episode for Monday, there would not be an episode on Monday. That sort of gets into your head, like, oh, you have to have an episode, and they always tell you like consistency is key, right? And then the other thing I've heard as well many times, I don't know if this still applies. I started in 2018, I think. They tell you like, you know, less than once a week. No way, man. You need at least once a week, twice or thrice is, you know, ideal. I mean, of course, if you can have a daily episode, right, that's a very sweet spot. For me, it was just out of the question, right? This has been a side job from the start. You know, in many ways, the podcast has helped me in many ways, but the podcast itself is not the job for me, right? There's people who do get, you know, 10 million downloads per episode, and hence, you know, if you pay 5 cents per download as a sponsor, you can live off that, you know, easily, right? That's not the case for the podcast, but you know, it's been thriving in that sense. Like I've gotten new people, you know, it's brought its own way of success. Like, you know, the typical thing of you get books from people, friends and people who are guests. Read this book. Let's talk about my book, and they send you over the book. I've gotten so many books. At this point, I don't get to read most of them. You know, opportunities to show up on other podcasts, opportunities to speak at conferences, opportunities to teach subjects at universities, which I do plenty of. So you know, from there, you know, once you have many speeches as well, you know, it starts building as well some form of reputation and so on. And that's what's really been the place where I professionally, thrive. Yeah, professionally, that would be. I was going to say personally, but it doesn't make sense. You know, it has nothing to do with my family. But that's where it has professionally flourished for me, where the podcast has allowed me to open new doors that lead to other places. You know, like in Zelda, right? You get to a dungeon, it's not just about getting in the dungeon. You have to go places, right? You go to the next, the next door. It's kind of been that kind of journey in that sense. And delighted to have it as well, having, as your listeners are all podcasters or aspiring podcasters, one of the thrills of the job, right, is actually having, for many of us, is having these interviews, right? Talking to people, having interesting conversations, finding out about things you didn't know, or confirming some of your beliefs, debunking your beliefs every now and then as well. Yeah. Yeah, it's been a fantastic journey, but I wish I told you there was a switch I just flipped on and it's just kept me going. But it's well, to be fair, there might be one thing, right? It started, I mentioned it started, and it is mostly a side gig, right? But I used to have a 9 to 5 job. And, the way for me to feel maybe that this was, a thing that was going to be something, and that is something nowadays, was to make sure, every week. And then you spend a month, and then you spend a year, right? And then you say, well, if I've done it for a year, I need to do it for another year. And then it's been 2 years, right? I have to continue doing it. So it kind of builds on itself in many ways, for the good and the bad as well. I think I mentioned before that I just skipped a week till this point because I was sick, but like really sick from COVID. But other than that, my daughter was born, and I remember she was born on a Saturday, on a Friday night. Well, no, it was Friday we arrived. She was born on Friday night, a Saturday night. So on Sunday, I sat down, I went to a corner, and I recorded an episode like this. My daughter was born this week. I'm super proud. Da, da, da. Like it's funny because if I had just been able to go home, I could have clicked 3 buttons and I would have had another episode. But that couldn't happen, right? I couldn't go home, and that was not a priority anyway. So I just went and I recorded a voice note almost of like 3 minutes. Said, my daughter was born. I'm super proud. See you next week. Boom. That was an episode, right? Like it initially that was kind of cheating, but it's not. It's fine, right? I think it was fine. Letting people in to some of the personal life was good as well. So it's just about that. Like, what's the next thing? And if you run out of guests, every now and then you say, well, what do I do? Is there something I've been meaning to speak about and I haven't because I haven't found the time? Well, now's the time. Like, I wanted to do a series on some of the things that I do, and I did a series, right? Like I did like 6 episodes, and that let me build back up. I'm not sure exactly when that was. But that kind of thing happens as well.
Super interesting. A lot to dive into there and unpack. I'd love to get like into the practicalities a little bit of like, you've got somewhat of a niche audience, topic, right? Gamification, which a lot of people probably have misconceptions about what it is or what have you. On that point about guest booking in a niche field, right? How do you go about that practically? Like, so I mean, this is the classic thing, by the way. We have a podcast about corporate treasury, for example, Guillaume and I, and it was our first podcast. It's how we got into podcasting. We started our agency and everything, and we were also like, how the hell? We don't know how many episodes we can squeeze out of this. We have no idea. And here we are, like 280 episodes in, or something like that, on that as well. And it's just like, there's 101 stories out there. Well, more than 101. There's an infinite number of stories out there. I think a lot of the theme or the format of the podcast is really, really important. If you're just talking about information, yes, at some point information you can get to the end of a course, right? A university course or whatever. But if you start going through stories or people's perspectives of what they've done in their role or their career in certain examples, if you just keep going through loads and loads of different examples of how gamification can enhance a product or how to do better at it or whatnot, then you're basically have an infinite number out there, right? I mean, it's in the high thousands, if not.
Two things out of that. Like, certainly, in fact, my podcast has a very, I don't want to say strict, because there's nothing strict about it, but I ask the same questions almost exactly every single time. And the answers are so diverse, right? Because I don't ask people, what is the definition of gamification? I don't ask people, how many days does a year have, right? That's not something you ask. That's, as you were saying, it's information, right? It's more about the stories, the experience that people have. And in my niche, because it's very, it's not niche because gamification is something that can only be used in certain places. That's definitely not the case. It is niche because the people willing to listen or interested in listening to a podcast about gamification is niche, right? So I just wanted to make sure that there's two different things there. So yes, it's very, very niche. There's not so many people doing this, which is also a blue ocean in many ways, the blue ocean strategy. When it was the hype back in the early 2010s, probably, everybody and nobody in their LinkedIn had gamification something on their title, right? Just like everybody and nobody has AI in their titles right now. I don't, by the way. I know basic things about AI, probably some misconceptions there. I'm not an expert in AI. I don't mean to be. I do what I do, right? But there's a lot of people that feel that if they don't put that in their title, it's not, they're nobody, right? So good thing is nowadays when people talk about gamification, game-based learning, game inspired, so whatever your game around these things, the good thing is they're really into that. So if you do a search on that, right, I can find guests that do that stuff. And for me, a small, I don't want to call it trick because it's actually sincere. I'm really interested in knowing when I interview somebody, I always ask them, is there somebody that you would like to listen to answering these questions, right? Because like everybody's standing on the shoulders of giants. And I've heard anything from Shigeru Miyamoto from Nintendo, right? That's like, well, maybe he'll be on the podcast someday. Probably not, but maybe. All the way to people who are no longer with us, right? That's acceptable. That's fine. I'm not gonna say, no, you have to tell me somebody who's alive and who you know so you can introduce me, right? That's never, it's never even, on the cards in that sense. But I have gotten, of course, several introductions through that way. And oftentimes after the interviews, I thought about these other 5 people. I'm going to introduce you to them right now. And they send the email, right? So you get other guests as well. It's also an opportunity to say, you would like to listen to Nir Eyal is one that many people mention because he's outside of gamification, more known for other things like the hooked model. And now he talks about how to be anti... I forgot the name of his latest book, but he's very known for those things. And, yeah, you would like to listen to that? Well, go to episode 101, I think is his episode. And you can listen to Nir Eyal. So I refer back to past episodes as well. It works out, a pretty neat circle. And I don't want to say I figured it out early because I didn't. I still haven't in many ways, I'm sure. But there are some things that if you sort of think about what are some of the ripples that you could get out of those kinds of questions, there's always a good thing. And then, of course, if you're just doing the podcast and you never get out of it, like you just do the podcast and you want to build your audience, if you have a large enough audience, you can just live off that and, do your sponsors as we were discussing before. If not, the other thing is you start, and even if you do, right, you start going to events, you start going to conferences, start going places and you meet other people there. And a good thing about conferences is oftentimes you get to meet unexpected people, right? And those unexpected people can be guests on the podcast as well. And you get fantastic people, lovely people you get to meet. You get to get new friends. I have a friend now who used to be in Mexico, now is in the US. Many others as well. All the way to people who are downright, I don't want to say the word, I don't know how PG rated this podcast is. People you don't want to talk to ever again, essentially. Like you talk to them there. This looks like a big figure. He has all these followers on YouTube or here or there. It's like, please, come to the podcast. And then it's like, my God, this diva person, I just don't want to talk to you. No matter if you pay me to be on the podcast or anything. Like I don't want to talk to you anymore. Right? You get everything, but you get new opportunities. Right? You get new opportunities to find new guests if that's the case.
I like that. And you've referred to it a couple times now, which is absolutely great. And I guess it fits the whole...
Oh, and I didn't answer your question. I have a tab and I just realized I didn't answer the question about gamification itself. We can get into that after.
Yeah, we can come back to it for sure. But I think maybe this comes back to that. So you made that Zelda example, which I love, right? Because you just framed a concept that I think about a lot in a gamified way, which is cool. Which is that a lot of the time you don't know what the next door is. You just have to enter the room, right, to see the next door, right? And you got to start moving in some direction, and then things come up. Especially in something like the beauty of podcasting, in some ways, is that it's by nature, unless you're doing a solo podcast, it's like a networking driven thing. If you're doing an episode, guest-based episodes on a regular basis, you're talking to a new person every week in your field, which could open a variety of doors, right? Either it's an introduction, it's getting your name out there, it's getting your podcast growing a little bit more, but you kind of, things happen, right? Just through having those conversations. And it's like that thing you said about the Zelda example. You have to go into the room to see the dungeon for the next one. And so you got to just take the next step. That's largely it. A lot of people get paralyzed by, what's this going to lead to? What's my model? How am I going to do this, etc. And like most people don't make it past episode 20, right? So there's a stat that we bring up quite a lot in the show, which is 90% of podcasts don't make it past episode 3. And of the ones that do, 90% don't make it past episode 20. So 20, if you've done 21 episodes, you're in the top 1% of all podcasts, largely, in terms of number at least. And the reason is because it's hard to be consistent in anything. That's why most people are fat. That's why most people haven't reached their goals. That's why most people anything, right? It's just hard to be consistent on anything at all. And having a podcast that has 360 episodes is an exercise in discipline, consistency, and that discipline and consistency in the right domain, of course, opens new doors for you as well, right? But you gotta play the game to be part of it, right? You gotta put the reps in. You gotta actually do the thing.
Like one of the things that and I heard this recently. There was this person, when it's gamification of learning, they say, well, you want to be able to help people see what's the end goal. And I respect that, and that sometimes makes a lot of sense. But sometimes you don't exactly know where that is. Sometimes you have to rescue Princess Zelda, maybe. But from what? Like, what's up? Like, you do the Ocarina of Time. I got a Nintendo 64 relatively recently, and I'm playing that one again. I love it. You have a sense that you're going to be, if you play the previous ones or you know anything about the lore, that you're going to be rescuing Zelda at some point. But you actually get to meet her in the game, and she's just living the palace, right? You're just like entering the next room to see what happens next, and she tells you that there's this whole conspiracy going on, right? And it actually gets to happen, right? Where this Ganondorf guy is, going to do these terrible things. But you're not rescuing her, right? Eventually you do, but it's not about that. Eventually that's what it gets to. But you start taking steps towards that. So some games like give you a clear, what's the end place you're reaching. And other ones it's like, well, let's see what's up, right? So let's see what's next. And sometimes I do think, as you were saying, you start podcasting and some people like sort of pressure you down into, what's going to be your monetization? What's going to be this and this and this and this? Yeah, you hopefully will get there, right? But maybe and I'm a living example of that. Like, monetization of the podcast itself is almost inexistent, right? I would never be able to live off at this point what I could make directly straight off of the podcast. There's all the other things and the other doors that can get open. That might be the place where you end, or maybe you hit a gold mine, right? You didn't expect to get 1 million downloads each month, and you eventually do get 1 million downloads. Well, that's great, right? But you don't really know until you start trying. This is the same as a product mentality in general, right? You think this is a problem I want to solve. What's the solution going to look like? Well, I don't know. Like, this is the next step I can take to get people closer to that solution. Let's see if people buy it. And if it works for them, right? If it does, let me see what else I can do or how I can make it better. I think it's part of the process, and I think we discussed about John Lee Dumas or with Guillaume, I'm not sure, that he says you want to be a podcaster, then do a podcast, right? That there's no other way. You don't become a podcaster by reading books or joining communities. You have to actually do the thing. So
he's been on the show. John Lee Dumas, he was a few episodes back. Yeah, he was on the show as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to be a podcaster if you want to podcast. You have to podcast if you want to be a podcaster. There's no, you don't become a podcaster before having a podcast.
And there's also, that advice isn't wrong in some domains though, right? Like, because you shouldn't just blindly step into things. That is a fair argument. But there is, I think it depends on like the opportunity cost and the risk, right? What are you putting on the line? Starting a podcast isn't a high risk activity. There's not a huge amount of startup capital. Arguably, it's zero, right? You can get a free subscription to a variety of number of podcast hosting websites. You probably have a decent headphone and mic already.
Even if you say the risk to my brand reputation. Oh my goodness. Tim Ferriss started a show and he said, look, I'm going to do 3 episodes. Maybe it doesn't work, but you can sure as heck know that he was going to get, hundreds of thousands of downloads. So if he, quote unquote, screwed up, a lot of people would have found out that he did it. He did the experiment, and look at what the Tim Ferriss show is nowadays, right? So, some people feel like, oh yeah, but my case is special because I'm famous, or my case is special because I'm not famous, or my case is special because I have no money. And you've been answering like 90% of those things or more at this point, right? So if you want to do it, if you feel there's value to that, and I think there is, it's just a question of getting going.
So, Rob, come on, bring us onto the topic of like gamification, right? So gamification is all about applying the principles of games to different domains, right? So it's like gamifying like processes to make them more enjoyable, to drive up engagement, to drive up retention, etc. I've heard this in the domain of productivity quite a lot back in my, maturing phase of life when I was trying to become a productive individual, and I followed all these big productivity guys. Yeah, half of it. Well, actually, yeah, part of maturing is realizing what works for you and what doesn't, right? Until then, you got to explore and do all the Pomodoro techniques and this and that. But one of the things that comes up quite a lot is, I think it's Thomas Frank is a YouTuber, productivity guy, and he talks a lot about gamification in life, right? And in productivity. And he says, gamify your things, give yourself points for completing certain tasks. Gamify like different things you don't want to do, like find a way to like, or there's another thing that's a very like common, let's say, motivation trope, which is like, think of yourself as like a character with skill levels, right? And be like, oh, yeah, correct. It's RPG in real life. And you kind of like think of yourself as a character with skill levels and like, oh, I got to max out this skill. Because in a game, like I played RuneScape growing up, and I think about RuneScape when I was a kid. I was like, the amount of hours I wasted mining, just mining, because I just wanted to get a certain number of ore or get myself to a certain level, or the amount of hours I wasted, I got to get my level up. I'm just going to walk around this forest and kill like these animals, right? Or like, I'm just going to like mine a bunch of ore, go away and smint it and then sell it just to make money. And I think back, I'm like, how did that keep me engaged as a human? I cannot for the life of me understand how it caught me. But I spent hours, I used to wake up early on a Sunday just to go and play RuneScape and mine some ore, right? So I'm sure there's something very powerful in that as a thing. But how can you apply gamification into your own life? Not just like into processes, but into your own life that you found to be effective?
So there's, I always like to talk when I talk about gamification and all these kinds of strategies. People get stuck up on what's exactly definition and all of that. I don't go down that route, right? Anything that looks like that, a simulation, game-based learning, whatever, I just call it gamification for the sake of people having a proxy understanding even of what that means, because it's all about having those tools in your tool belt if they can be useful for you. For me, it's always like, in general, if you want to use these strategies, the first thing that you have to have very clear, just as like almost anything in life, is what do you want to achieve? Like, why would you go through the effort? Because it is an effort. It always is, right? Of using these tools which require your thinking, your effort, your time. Why would I go through that if I can just continue doing whatever it is that I'm doing, right? So the answer to that question is where you start getting, it starts getting very, very important for you. And of course, sometimes you get a superficial answer and you do it many times until you get to something that's really important. Then if you're doing it with yourself, the advantage is you kind of get to know yourself pretty well, or you can, you don't have to make interviews to other people. Maybe you have to answer questionnaires, or you can look at those what Disney Princess questionnaires on Facebook. I think there was plenty of these quizzes, right? To get to, yeah, you get to know yourself a little bit more, right? Get to understand, get to sink down with memory. In your case, you talk about RuneScape, right? And probably others. What are the things that get me motivated, that get me out of bed on a Sunday morning, right? Why am I doing this like why? Answering those questions and understanding what kind of player you are in that case is crucial. so that then you can say, well, from RuneScape, I learned this, or from this other game, from Zelda, we mentioned before, I learned this other thing, and from this other game, I learned this other thing about myself, right? Because that's something that motivates me. How can I use that for my own benefit? I had I've had like different types of guests, but one that is like very specialized in what she calls self gamification, is Victoria. And for the life of me, I won't get her last name right, so I'm not going to try. At this point, you can find her on professorgame.com. You look for Victoria, one or two will come up. One is called like self gamification or something like that. And she talks about the simplest of things. Sometimes it's, you were talking about an RPG character. Well, you don't have to build out and make a list of all your skills in the world, and that's just about the ones that you think are important and the ones you want to get better. The rest are not relevant for this exercise, right? You sit that down and say, well, how can I get more of this skill? And another thing, when you're analyzing apps and that kind of stuff through some frameworks, oh, but is the number 84 or is it 73? It doesn't matter. Like, it really doesn't matter. The number itself doesn't matter. What it matters is that you have that perception of where you're at and how you want to continue moving forward. And what are the things that you need to do? You need to take a course. You need to, you want to do push-ups every day to build your body. Like, whatever that is, you're building your skills there. That could be an example of, building your own RPG character. I know there's a talk recently about that, by the way. I'd have to look up who it was, because my fellow co-teacher in one of the courses I teach, he mentioned it. He went to the conference and talked about it, but I'd have to look it up. But there's all sorts of people doing stuff like this. The key thing is that you do those things, you get to those game mechanics, and you test it out, right? Do it for a week. Is it working? Am I getting better? All right, that's good. It's not the end of it, because, of course, a week is relatively easy. What happens next week and the next week and the next week? I'm losing motivation here. Do I have to change something? Maybe I have to introduce something new to keep that novelty going, whatever that looks like, right? It depends on you individually. What is the end game for you? Is there an end game, or is this something of continuous improvement? Or have I reached enough in this skill? What's the next skill I want to get into? And then, doing that. Again, it's going to, as you said at the start, you switch on that button of consistency. Here, it's the same thing, right? What's the button you switch on to do this in your personal life? Well, that's the thing, right? I didn't even play RuneScape. I've heard of the game, but I haven't played it myself. I have no idea. I would have to look into it, and I could, to help you individually with that. You can do that for you individually. You can do that for a group of people. But what you don't do is you don't do it for everyone and anyone, right? Because you do it for everyone and you do it for no one. This is a design discipline, right? You're creating a solution to a specific problem for a specific even person or type of person, right? So that's where, sometimes it gets difficult, when there are, very successful and useful platforms that can do many things for you, especially when it's about, using tech when you're not a tech person. But that's just a piece of the puzzle. I would argue that one of the most difficult ones is actually coming up with a solution that works. That's crucial, and that's more difficult, and it takes time, and that's where your brain power needs to be going strongly, because in tech nowadays, this, right? Almost anything is possible. And I say almost because then people start imagining, on top of the imagination and on top of that, and you start thinking of an AI that does everything for you. Well, we're not there in some cases, right? But most of the things, you needed to do this task, there's always either something created or it can be created. That's not a limit anymore.
So I think you're applying this as well. Like, looking back at, is there a world where you can look back at what games you really enjoyed as a kid to understand what motivates you? Is that like a psychoanalysis that someone can run? So, like, what games did I love? Assassin's Creed was something I played a lot of. I played all of the early ones. RuneScape, what else did I play? I never went to Minecraft because, like, it was too open. There was like too much to do in Minecraft, so I was like, I don't even know what to do, so I'm not going to start. I need which probably tells me I need some guidance, some structure, but I like following along. That's interesting.
You just figured out something about yourself all by yourself. Like, I literally said nothing. You looked back at it and said, oh, this game was not structured, so maybe I need structure.
Yeah, a goal. Yeah, there's not, like, Minecraft doesn't have at least the versions I played didn't have a goal like in the right way. Um, but I also like I play Call of Duty and FIFA, but only for the social aspect. I can't play the story mode. Sometimes I nowadays I don't play anything. Nowadays I only play games when it's social, right? So it's only when it's like multiplayer games.
But that's also important, right? Like, yeah, of course. Like I can tell you, I played Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles all the time when I was a kid, right? A social aspect was key to it. When I could play multiplayer, I could spend a lot more time doing it. But it's also important to understand and realize that, of course, we evolve and we change, right? What motivated you back then to wake up on a Sunday morning might not be exactly the same today, right? You have, let's call them responsibilities, let's call them things that you have to do, whatever you want, right? So, getting out of those is different than when you were a kid. But still, you play games and games. We've been talking about video games all this time, but games are board games. In fact, I'm like, this is my latest prototype. Let me have it here in my desk so I can show it to you. Give me a second. Yeah, like literally, I have, since we also have video version of this, right? You can see that I have, this is my latest prototype. Like, it's a bunch of pieces of paper. These are index cards, right, that I use for writing stuff down. It's that simple as this one. This is the idea of the players. These cards, I just use them as sort of a board, to not have a board, so I don't need a board at this point. And these are resources. These are literally pieces of paper I colored with some markers just to differentiate from the three resources I have at this point. And I need more, so I wanted to make sure I had something that was easy to multiply. But it can look like that. That's something I'm going to use in my classroom, hopefully in a few weeks. And it can look all the way up to a super tech hyped VR, AR, AI. What other trend word do we have around us? It can have all those things, right? In the metaverse, right? AI, VR, metaverse, all these things can be together in the solution for sure, but it doesn't have to be, right? You don't have to have a AAA budget, right? Millions of dollars. There's a huge company here in Spain called I forgot the name. It's a huge company here. They started and they literally got from the EU something like €1 million for their first game, and they spent like 4 years developing it. And thank God it went well, right? Because otherwise, they wasted 4 years and €1 million, right? It went fantastically. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure they tested out a lot and so on. But then the next one they invested, whether their own money or again European money, I have no idea. And then it was like 2.5 years instead of 4. At this point, they created something so that people can create their own games. But they started with huge budgets. Great. They're a huge company now and they sell all over the world to very, very big companies. But not everybody has to do that, right? Maybe you're looking to scale, but scaling means that initially you don't have something that everybody buys. You start with small group, you test it out, see what works, get it better, and so on.
So bringing this back to podcasting for a second, Rob, and that's kind of why I went down a little bit of the self-development part of this as well. You're someone that's been incredibly successful in your podcast, and I call success being this consistent. That's successful in my mind. Anyone that's made 360 episodes is a successful podcaster, regardless of download stats or whatever, which I know yours are good as well. The question I have is like, but you described it almost in a gamified way as well. You're like, oh, I've done this many episodes, I got to do the next one. And then it's like, I've got a year done. I got to keep going. And then you got 2 years done. Like you're looking at your stats in a way and being like, okay. And it's like a self-motivation almost as well. On the spot. Yeah, 100%. 100%. And then otherwise the bird threatens you in your sleep. Have you seen those memes about Duolingo? Because you mentioned Duolingo a couple of times now, which is gamified language learning. I get it. There's all these memes about how like because it sends you these like passive aggressive notifications now, and they actually changed the icon of the app as well. And then there's all these memes about I'm scared the Duolingo bird's gonna kill me in my sleep because I didn't log into it. But can you? I'm putting you on the spot here. Give some tips to podcasters for gamifying staying consistent.
So I would say that the first thing is what you're looking for is staying consistent means delivering whatever your podcast schedule looks like, right? And then the next thing that I would do is ask them to break that down, because that means a different thing for different people, right? If you have a crew that's doing a bunch of stuff for you, what does it mean for you to stay consistent? Well, you have to just almost show up, right? It's different for that kind. If you're a solo podcaster, it means, a lot of things. If you have a guest, you have to find a guest. Then you have to, how much edits you do, then you have to upload, then you have to there's a bunch of things that could be involved. So you would go through what are all those different steps that you need to take. Make sure that everything is very well written down. And we were talking about RPGs before, so if that's something that in some way, video game, real life tabletop RPGs or whatever RPGs you might have been into, if that's something that motivates you and that you like, maybe write down, what does that look like for you as a character, right? What does having an additional episode mean, right? Is it just a stat of now I have 360 like I do at the point of when we're recording? Or does that mean that I am, 10 away from, I don't know, something, whatever you have on your mind about reaching episode 370 or episode 5, right? Whatever that looks like. What is it that I am building towards, right? And when you have these RPGs where you're building those stats, it's because you want to become the strongest warrior of the realm or the town, and then you get out of the town, you go to the city. That kind of thing could be something that you could be using in your own motivation. You use that mechanic of building your stats so that you have a friendly daily reminder of, today I have to do this so that I can reach this other thing, right? Visualizing, and that's why I talked about having all those very, very detailed and clear steps of all the things that you need to do. So you start, you could even have a checklist for each episode. Oh, I have already done this, already done this, already done this. And there, every time you check there, you could even almost take it back to some stats. There's, I think they're still around. It's called Habitica. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Nobody that I've known really knows how to do it. It's literally one of these 8-bit RPGs where you start building your character and so on. You could build a checklist of the things that you need for every podcast. What's it building onto? And, every day, literally, or every week, you start building onto that and your character starts getting stronger and you start getting more things. It's about what that represents for you that makes it meaningful. Right. If podcasting is just, they told you have to have a podcast and you're just doing it because you have to, I don't think anything's going to work unless you dive deep down and understand what could be the value for you. And, I know I'm on a podcaster's podcast, but if you can't find it, then maybe you shouldn't be doing a podcast. And I think that's okay as well. I mean, sometimes people say, well, what if the solution is not gamification? What do you do? Well, I tell them, right? That's not the solution. Hopefully, the next person in line will have that in their, that will be what they will be needing and will be building that solution. But even if there's not a line, right, I'm not going to tell somebody who doesn't need that solution to do that just because that's my realm. There's other things that you could be doing. And hopefully we're just here to add value, especially as a podcaster. I always feel that there's sort of a need to be delivering constant value to people because that's kind of what the whole industry is about.
Awesome. Makes so much sense. Rob, thank you so much for coming on podcast for us.
If you want to continue thinking about these things, right, there is a free resource I offer. Yes, at the end, you might want or not want to purchase something from me. That's entirely up to you, but it's free, right? You don't need to give anything. If you go to professorgame.com/free gamification course, and I'm sure you'll be able to put that in the show notes if you guys want.
We will do.
You will do that. You'll sign up to my email list and it's literally 3 episodes. It's 3 days, one after another. You get an email. You get that. If you don't want to listen from me ever again, you just unsubscribe and that's it. You got that value. And there you'll be making an exercise on what using some game mechanics can look like for you. And again, that's for you. It's not for everyone. What is that solution that you might be looking for? Then you could dive deeper and so on. But I just want you to get your hands dirty in the sense of what gamification could look like. And if that's something that's attractive, then you could be using for whatever business purposes you have with it.
Absolutely amazing. All the links will be in the show notes below. Happy to do that. Rob, thank you so much.
Cheers. Have a good one.